Thank you, Becky. I wanted to read, just quickly, a quick summary from one of the reviews from the Minneapolis paper that I thought summed up the story better than I've been able to do, better than a lot of other people have been able to do. It says, it can be dangerous to pull on a thread from the past, but Eddie McBride, an architect and rather selfish guy, does it anyway, launching readers into a time-hopping journey across the generations. The book, One Red Thread, is on the surface about time travel, but it's also about learning family secrets, it's about relationships, it's about coming to grips with what you have to accept from your past and what you, in this case, since it's time travel, maybe can change. What I'm going to read is the second time in which the character Eddie time travels. There's no time machines or anything involved here. This is a way that he discovers, it's almost more of a meditative state, to explain it very simply, that he can sense sounds and smells, other remnants of the past that are still out there, and then use those to then see the event that produced those in the first place. In this particular instance, he has gone back to when he's 8 years old, it's about 1960, and he's come to a funeral. And he suddenly realizes, after being there for half an hour or so, that it's not the person he thought it was. He thought it was a neighbor, and it's his great uncle. There's some things in every family that no one understands. I'm talking about the things other than the good luck and the bad, the unexpected fortunes and illnesses, and short-term, one-off events that can strike every household. I'm talking about long-running stories with faraway origins, stories embedded in the family consciousness. The McBride family certainly had one of those stories. His name was Great Uncle Hugh. I remember Hugh. He was a quiet man, simple and innocent as a child, with the family, but a mysterious specter about town. I was 8 when he died, and even before the funeral, I met a barrage of playground speculation about the old man's death. According to one story, he'd walked out the front door and disappeared, only to be found later dead in a ditch. Another claimed he'd stepped behind the clothes hanging in his closet and put a bullet in his head. In this version, his body lay among the shoes and piled up dirty shirts for days. You know how kids are. They're always letting their imaginations run, trying to be as gruesome as possible. I had to argue them down. That's not right, but no one believed me. The family, of course, was more respectful. As far back as I could remember, whenever anyone spoke of Hugh, it was only in whispers and hints. He may not have shot himself in the end, but he'd suffered something catastrophic when he was young. No one ever told the complete tale, and if I asked for more, I was shushed. Hugh, I was regularly reminded, was a delicate soul, and I was not to disturb my great uncle or anything about him. As a boy myself, I wondered long and hard about Hugh when he was my age. That's the thing. Being a kid often means dealing with the gruesome, though it could also mean sympathetically wondering about other kids. But the only evidence I had was the Hugh I saw before me, and all I could gather was that he came and he went. He worked some kind of job downtown, but at home he remained alone as much as he could. On weekends, he worked by himself in the garden. The only excitement I ever witnessed or even heard about was the day he cut the head off a snake with his shovel. Killing that snake hadn't been necessary, and it may even have been an honest mistake. It was a corn snake, and yes, it was a frighteningly long 5 feet. Yes, it looked a lot like a copperhead, but it was one of the good snakes that kept down the rodent population without hurting people. It wasn't poisonous, and now it was dead. No one criticized Hugh as he stood in the garden, quietly alone after what he'd done. Everyone always gave Hugh latitude with the benefit of the doubt. But I saw him crying as he looked down at the lonely head and the lifeless body in the dirt. Hugh spent the longest time just looking and crying. When he finally dropped the shovel, it fell straight and neat into one of the plowed rows, as if he wanted it that way, as if this action wasn't a mistake. Then he turned quickly, crossed the yard, and entered the house. He cried all the way. Killing a good snake was sad, was bad. I knew that. But like I said, that was all the excitement I could ever find in Hugh's story. Every time I was up at the big Victorian house, I'd watch him from a distance across the yard or down at the other end of the porch. Hugh was such a mystery, I never knew what to say to him, so I said very little. I'd go out and fetch him when one of the aunts asked me to, and take him a glass of water on a hot day in the garden. "Thank you," he'd say. Always the same response, always respectful in his own meek and far-off way. I'd linger, kicking a clod of dirt here and there, waiting for a little more insight, for something to happen, but it never did. Well, I never saw it. I was only a boy. "Edward," the old lady at the funeral whispered to me in a rough voice, "I know this is hard, but you sit here by me and you be good." Instantly, when she spoke, I recognized her as Hugh's sister, my great aunt Eleanor. She gently reached across her lap and twined her fingers of her gloved hand with my fingers. But how did she know me? She couldn't have recognized me as a man. She was treating me as a boy. She squeezed my fingers gently. The priest began his eulogy, though he didn't have much to say about a man who kept to himself. There was some story about Hugh's fascination with the mother-of-pearl inlays on some accordion. That I'd never heard. Hugh was always there at parties, the priest was saying. He was always quietly watching. But that, yes, that was Hugh. After the ceremony, Aunt Eleanor put her hand into the crook of my arm and began steering toward the foyer. I couldn't stop looking around. The house with its furnishings was at once so different from the one I lived in and so familiar in my childhood memory. "No one ever knew," she said, leaning against me as we walked, "what poor Hugh was thinking. But all these years, it was like he was just waiting to die." "Ma'am?" I hadn't addressed anyone so formally in years, but it seemed like the right thing to do. "And how was that?" By then we'd been joined by Grand Aunt Lillian. "You know," she frowned, "it was last week." I stared at the ceiling. That playground story about suicide said blood had dripped through from Hugh's closet. "No," I whispered. "No, I don't think I do." "Sister," scolded Eleanor, "it's not a mystery." "No," replied Lillian, "but he knows this." Both women turned my way. "You were there." I racked my brain. My childhood didn't yield up whatever there was to remember about Hugh. Everything I recalled about Hugh was fuzzy. A man's entire life, at least to an observer who'd been only a boy, seemed, well, vague. Uncle Hugh was a presence that simply hovered somewhere above me, seen through the mist, through a kind of sickbed grogginess. That was it. A week earlier, I had been sick in bed, sleepy and groggy in our house across town. "My God," I whispered, "the measles. He caught the measles and he died." "He caught the measles and he caught pneumonia," corrected Lillian. "He coughed himself to death." "Hugh tried to help," said Eleanor, her voice quavering. "He always tried to help." She removed a carefully folded tissue from the sleeve of her dress, where she kept it against the inside of her wrist. She dabbed her eyes, left, right, left again, and returned the tissue to its hiding place. "I remember," I said, watching as the men from the funeral home navigated the casket toward the front door. "Uncle Hugh sat on the side of my bed and fed me soup. I was propped up with a pile of pillows in the dark room, and he was leaning over me." "Hugh never did anything to hurt anyone," said Lillian, "and look what happened to him." "Sister," interrupted Eleanor, "you stop that. It's not the boy's fault." "No, it's not the boy's fault. But you just think what happened to our little brother. He was the child of our father's old age. When Hugh came, there was so much hope, and all of it was stolen. Now people are saying he caught that pneumonia on purpose." My adult ears pricked up. "On purpose?" Aunt Eleanor was aghast. "Don't even think that." "Well," said Lillian, "they're saying it. They're saying he wanted to die." But our brother didn't die last week. The boy we knew died 50 years ago, the day he went out with that crowd of men, the day the boy we loved came home and wasn't himself anymore. That's when our brother really died. The maiden aunts put their arms around one another and cried for their brother, but for the longest time, no one stepped forward to console them. Uncle Hugh's funeral had been awkward enough, memorializing a man who'd been dead to most people even while he lived. The only one who made the gesture was a boy. He seemed to understand. The boy put his arms around the women and wept with them. Eleanor pulled the boy closer. Poor thing, she said. My childhood self had arrived. I wanted to say something about arriving before the kid. Hey, look at me. For 10 or 20 minutes, I'd been a participant in the funeral. I'd seen and talked to the aunts, long gone aunts, but I could tell they wouldn't see me now. They'd see me as the boy, or they'd see me as the boy, as both the adult and the boy, all in one. They'd see me the way our former selves and the people who we later become blend over the years and live together. Lillian stroked the boy's hair. Poor child. I took a step backward, my adult self now back to being an observer. That's what I should have been doing, closely watching. And that's what I should have been seeing, other people in their pain. What was I thinking instead? Hey, look at me. What an idiot. So, questions? Yes.
The thing that interests me is the time travel. How'd you come up with that idea? It seems like that opens up a lot of possibilities to write about history and everything else.
It does. This was, it's hard to say. Yeah, I wrote this for about 10 years. At the time, I was reading a lot of, I was doing meditation. I was reading a lot of mysticism, the Eastern philosophy. I kept running across things, like in a book of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he's talking about how you can, when he talks about you can levitate, you can be in two places at one time. I started thinking, well, that's interesting, being in two places at one time. I ran across a couple of other things in similar sorts of writings that started me thinking about that. I also ran across a theory that there is that there really are elements still out in the atmosphere that don't degrade, so that when you breathe them in and you breathe it back out, then other people breathe it in and breathe it out. And thinking that specifically argon gas, which doesn't change. It's not like oxygen. You breathe in argon, you breathe argon right back out. And so those of us in this room are breathing the argon that each other breathe, and there are theories that those of us in this room may be breathing things that people breathed in and out hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. So you start thinking about that as sort of a mechanism for time travel. I didn't really want to write a science fiction book, though. And this really isn't. I mean, it's only about half of it takes place in the past, maybe less than half of it. A lot of it takes place in the present. A lot of it is about people's, when Eddie that comes back from the past, what has this done to his relationship with other people in the present? He's learned things about his family. He's seen things happen that now he knows what the cause was for events that are happening now that nobody else does. And so that begins to change his relationship with his wife and his business partner and his best childhood friend, some of whom are arguing with him, don't ever do this again, and some are arguing, teach me how to do it, I want to do this too. So you get that sort of conflict. So I wanted to write a story about family history, and it seemed a good way to actually, they always tell you to show, don't tell. And it seemed to be a good way to show history happening and not just talk about it. In this particular passage, one of the reasons why I picked this is it does get somewhat into that. So you see a little bit of Eddie's personality. He's this sort of obsessively sort of self-aware person who's very, very aware of what's going on around him all the time, which is how he manages to figure out how to see these remnants of events from the past. But you also begin to see relationships with his family. You see whatever happened to his Uncle Hugh is introduced here very briefly, but it becomes a major part of the story later. Yes?
Yeah, I thought in what you read, there was a comment sort of referencing that it was similar to it's like if I meet an old friend again.
Right.
That as I interact with them, I'm interacting both with who they are now and who we were as children.
Right. Right.
And that's a really kind of a wonderful, wonderful notion.
Yeah, thank you. That is another reason why I like this particular passage, because it gets at that. He goes back and, who are you really? I mean, if you see an old friend, if you see your spouse, somebody you've known for 20, 30, 40 years, you don't really think about how old they are. You see the essence of the person. So if you go back in the past, who is it that really goes back there? What do they see when they see you? They're seeing, and there is discussion of this later in the book. This is the first time it's introduced. But the question of is, they're interacting with your essence or your soul or whatever you want to call it. But it is exactly what you're talking about. You see the entire life of this person. If you see your old college roommate and you're 50 years old, you're seeing him when he's 50, but you're seeing him when he's 18 at the same time.
Yeah, that's true.
So that is something that is treated in here.
What do you think he, in doing all of this, what do you think he discovers about himself?
Ooh, how can I explain that without a spoiler?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean
He, the question is whether this is a good idea or not.
Right.
Do you want to go back and learn things? Would you change things if you could? If you did, how would they, what would happen? And I shouldn't tell you whether he actually changes anything or not.
Right.
But it does change him.
Yeah.
A character has to change over time in the course of the book, of any book really. And he does learn things, and his relationship with everybody around him in the present does change considerably. Probably for the better, I would say that. For most people.
Okay.
Yes?
Well, full disclosure here, I'm Ernie's wife. If you could share with people your research process, I think that would be really interesting, particularly those who are writing and want to know how to go about finding local information about the past.
Some of this is just my own memory. I mean, this particular passage, there is little things like, when I was a kid, the yard man cut a head off a snake, and it was a non-poisonous snake, and all the neighbors were outraged. Oh, you killed this big, it was a black snake. You killed the snake, and you shouldn't have, because he's good for the neighborhood. Part of it is I was looking for names for elderly people. These are people that would have been born about 1890, and I couldn't name them Tiffany or Bethany. I couldn't give them a current name. So, but Lillian was my grandmother's name. Eleanor was my mother's middle name. So there are some people in this story that have real names from my family that go back. So part of it was mining those sorts of things. Part of it was I did do some research at the Austin History Center. The book, if you look at the geography of what went on, it never says it's Austin, because I've taken pieces from different cities and put them together. But the basic geography is Austin. This Victorian house where he lived would be south of the river, then there's the river, then there's downtown, there's the courthouse, there's no university, that's not part of the story. But So I went back and looked at the American Statesman. I looked at old maps and things from where things were at